Both of you. I can't save you. I wish the boy would help. I'm not even talking about taking care of your wife. But no, all you do all day long is lie on the couch. You bring pennies to the house, if you bring anything at all, and you have no shame or conscience. You're not a man, you degenerate. Camille was angry and could not help but tell her son-in-law everything she thought about him. For months, Stephen had not let her or her grandson live in peace. He was so greedy and cynical that he had no sympathy for his seriously ill wife. Once again, Camille wondered why she had found her Emily in him at all, complaining that her daughter had separated from her ex-husband, who was a perfect son-in-law compared to Stephen. Camille could not influence him in any way, but she could not kick him out of the apartment either. When after the divorced daughter Emily tied her fate with her new husband, the mother had to sell her modest 2-bedroom to add her daughter's money to buy a new apartment, where they moved to live with the whole so-called family. What the woman initially opposed, but thinking about the fate and future life of her grandson, all the same agreed to live with her new son-in-law under one roof. Half of the housing was taken by the ex-husband, who in no way agreed to leave the apartment to his ex-wife. Why should I? Indignantly asked Christopher when it came to the division of property. If I every counter-cross, with whom I lived without a year a week, will leave an apartment, then, not even our, myself homeless will remain homeless. And why would I be? My parents participated in the purchase of our family nest, so both legally and equitably, I have every right to an equal share. Christopher didn't consider the fact that Emily would have to raise her son on her own after the divorce. No, he wasn't even thinking about giving him up, but he wasn't going to go beyond his paternal obligations either. I'll pay child support, he said. It's not even a question, and take John on weekends, but I'll fire you for everything else. After all, I offered to let him stay with me, and you said no. Was that your choice? Emily was happy with that. Some fathers do nothing for their children after divorce, she reasoned, sitting with her mother over a cup of tea. But you do? But it lasted only until a new man came into Emily's life. When Christopher found out, he got very angry. What new daddy? He asked John when the boy was once again visiting his father for the weekend. By that time, Christopher had already managed to get his own one-room apartment, part of the money for which again added parents, because the proceeds from the exchange of joint housing with his wife funds for the purchase of a decent apartment, which would fully suit him, the man was not enough. Stephen visits me and my mother all the time, replied little John. And my mom says that very soon he will be my new dad. And we used to go to the movies, and he used to buy me cotton candy. There was no limit to Christopher's anger. That evening, he called his ex-wife, and when he realized she wasn't alone, he got even angrier. What kind of example are you setting for your son? Christopher yelled into the phone. Bringing men into the house. No, dear, we didn't agree to this. Emily didn't even try to justify herself. The woman was greatly surprised by her ex-husband's call, but she was even more surprised by the claims he dared to make against her. Christopher, you and I divorced, and now everyone builds his life independently as he sees fit. I don't understand why we're having this conversation. Emily tried to keep calm, but the dialogue is gradually turning into a scandal. Christopher's flow of utterances was unstoppable. It was like he'd lost his mind. Emily heard more and more sarcastic, humiliating insults that she couldn't bear to hear. Is that so? She exclaimed when her ex-husband paused in his eloquence. You and I will communicate only about our son, and I don't intend to talk about anything else. I hope you heard me. But Christopher had no intention of heeding his ex-wife's words. That evening he made a rather serious decision, which affected not only Emily herself, but also little John, who was not guilty of anything and sincerely loved their parents, both mom and dad. If John gets a new father, I will have no further involvement in his upbringing. Just so you know, and you won't get any child support either. Christopher voiced his ultimatum harshly and uncompromisingly. Emily did not understand why he reacted so sharply to her desire to arrange her personal life. The woman did not consider her ex-husband a serious obstacle on the way to his goal, and to break off relations with Stephen too was not going to. Camille did not like Emily's new suitor, and when the daughter asked her mother to participate in the purchase of a joint apartment, were wary. Doesn't he have his own place? She asked. Why should I sell my 2-room apartment? Because my money to buy a full-fledged apartment is not enough. Emily answered calmly. and it would be much more comfortable for all of us to live together. You still don't think John will go to school? Someone should meet him and see him off. My mom could really use a job too. Stephen's not home 24 hours a day either. The prospect of Camille's daughter getting married didn't please her at all. If she had found a worthy man, the woman would not say a word. But a simple bomber, who in addition still has the traits of a criminal, did not cause her absolutely no sympathy. The woman agreed to buy a 2-bedroom apartment together just to look after her grandson. Little wonder what he's capable of. Little wonder what's in his head, she thought to herself anxiously to John. Stephen's mother, who had come to the wedding, was not thrilled with her son's decision either. Even before he had proposed to Emily, the woman had made numerous comments about their relationship. Why do you need a woman with a child? Waving her hands and not hiding her indignation, asked Jenna. Do you really need such a burden? She raised Stephen alone, and her son was the only light in the window for her. She was willing to do anything for him. She worked 3 jobs, denied herself everything, bought anything he didn't ask for. But the woman did not have enough income to buy a separate place for her son, and the exchange would have left them on the street. They lived in a simple 1-bedroom apartment, which Jenna had gotten by happy coincidence. When her mother, who wanted to move her conflicted daughter somewhere else, kindly bought her a modest apartment in a neighboring city, which could not be exchanged for 2 apartments. At one time, the woman even seriously considered moving into a room, but in time to grasp, what does it turn out to be? She thought to herself then and there. Stephen will move into a room too. But no, better a separate apartment. Stephen's life with her mother was getting harder every day. Even though Jenna often slept in the kitchen, giving her son a whole room to himself, he didn't want to live like that for the rest of his life. Meeting Emily was the starting point for him. The man immediately realized that if she managed to persuade her mother to buy a 2-bedroom apartment, he could move into a more decent, spacious conditions just by the fact of marriage. Stephen was quite content with this, considering Emily's attitude toward him. He realized that it would be much easier to get along with her than with his mother, who constantly lectured him and told him that he had no aspirations in life. No, it wasn't that he was getting married for the apartment. Stephen wanted a family, but it had to be one that would not burden him. John was not an obstacle for him. The man was sure that after the wedding all the worries about the boy would fall on the shoulders of his mother-in-law and would not touch him. For 10 years of their life together, Jenna was never able to establish a relationship with either Camille or Emily. She just didn't need to. Left alone, the woman realized that her life was not so bad. She did not want to burden herself with socializing with people who were extremely unpleasant to her, thus making it clear that she did not mind a landlady with a boy who was not her own, so she behaved coldly and indifferently. Stephen, on the other hand, realizing that his mother was not at all eager to communicate either with his newly made wife or with his mother-in-law, behaved very correctly and did not try to persuade her otherwise. No matter how Emily tried to talk to the ex-husband and convince him that the child is not guilty of anything and should not be a bargaining chip in their relationship, everything was useless. First, the ex-husband stopped contacting her, and a few weeks later, when Emily decided to go to his apartment, she found out that he just disappeared. What do you care about him? The girl who had reluctantly opened the door asked unhappily. I'd like to talk to him, Emily replied calmly. Who are you? What are you doing here? The apartment was rented to us, mumbled the stranger, who did not deign to give her name. And anyway, I don't have to report to you. If you have some assholes with the owner, it's not for me. Judging by the manner of conversation, Emily realized that her ex-brother-in-law rented the apartment obviously in a hurry and was not too selective in the choice of tenants. All the way home, she pondered whether she should call Christopher's parents. But Camille immediately talked her daughter out of the idea. But why Mom? Emily asked in surprise, when she was heard and told not to try to seek meetings with her ex-husband. In fact, he is just as much a parent. And after all, the payment of alimony and communication with his son no one canceled, and he's all for squabbling. Let him live his life as he wants, Camille replied. After all, you too, to put it bluntly, not in a white coat standing. It's never one person's fault if there's a family breakdown. It's always the responsibility of both. The woman had no particular sympathy for her daughter's first husband either. Christopher immediately seemed too spoiled. This mama's boy, who in case of any problems clings to the parent's skirt. But from the moment Emily got in touch with Stephen, Camille regretted that her daughter's first marriage broke up. And it wasn't just that the son was fatherless. After all, Christopher was a much better candidate for a husband. Parents provided the family with material support, helped with the purchase of an apartment, in which Camille invested the last money, selling the old house of his mother. As life showed, Christopher was indeed much better than Stephen. With her second husband, daughter also did not live soul to soul. Conflicts between them occurred regularly, but unlike the situation with Christopher, with Stephen, Emily always tried to compromise. She was too afraid to be alone. After all, the years were passing, and it was hard enough for a woman, especially with a child, to find a husband. Emily understood this, but Camille refused to understand. Every day Stephen became more and more lazy and careless. And if in the first years of his life he at least regularly worked, then after 10 years he dissolved himself completely. Money brought into the house cat's puss, and spent more than sometimes. Most of Emily's salary went not to her son, but to her husband, who not only ate a lot, but also constantly needed something. He'd have to buy a new jacket or shoes. He always chose the most expensive things. And Emily uncomplainingly agreed to these thoughtless purchases. "Mom, we have a common budget," she would say when Camille resented her daughter for spoiling her husband too much. "If I need something, I'll buy it too." And Stephen won't say a word to them. Only Emily needed something once every 5 years. She wore clothes for years. She didn't buy makeup because she didn't have time to put on makeup. She worked her ass off. John was growing up, and because of the emerging relationships in the family was constantly serious and gloomy. Unlike his mother, he constantly remembered his father. There wasn't a day that went by that John didn't mention his dad, who had never once appeared in their lives since he disappeared without a trace. Even when Emily had filed for termination of parental rights, she had never heard from Christopher. Camille thought that was odd. Had he received the summons and ignored it? She wondered to herself, were some ridiculous grudges more precious than her own child? There were no answers to these questions, and the woman did not try to look for them. She had neither time nor energy for that. Emily remained in a slight ignorance about her spouse for many years, or only pretended to be. This Camille did not know exactly, and if not for the disease that struck her daughter dead, it is possible that they would have lived together for several more decades and even died on the same day. But fate had it differently. The diagnosis was a real blow to Emily, like a thunderbolt. "You don't look so good. You should get yourself checked out. It's not 25 years old anymore. It's time to start taking care of your health." Camille had noticed her daughter's strange behavior for a long time. Sometimes Emily wasn't herself. But not until she started to lose weight and huge circles appeared under her eyes. The woman wrote off her daughter's condition as fatigue. But the moment came when Emily really felt so bad that she could not go to work in the morning. If for many months she was brushed off, referring to the busyness, then she realized the entire blunder of her decision to refuse to see a doctor. "Unfortunately, the tumor is no longer abundant," the doctor said after the examination. "You came too late." "Now what?" Emily exclaimed. "Isn't there anything that can be done?" "There's something you can do to cure me. There's therapy and stuff." "Why do other people get better?" "I can't." The doctor didn't know what to say to Emily and just looked down at her. When she got home, she told her mother and burst into tears. "Maybe we should try other clinics?" Through her tears, suggested Camille, who could not believe her ears. Woman. Her daughter's diagnosis hurt as much as Emily herself. She was still so young, so beautiful. How could this be? She thought to herself day and night, and these thoughts would not let her rest. It was useless. Local doctors could not say anything concrete, except that they could not help Emily to survive, and potential trips to Moscow and abroad provoked global family disputes. "So, to be examined there, we need to sell our apartment at least," exclaimed Stephen, who clearly did not like the idea. "It would cost a lot of money. Where are we going to get it?" It was not the first bell that showed the real attitude of her husband to Emily. But it was the one she perceived so acutely that for the first time in many years between the spouses there was a real scandal. "You're only interested in apartments and money?" "Yes, Emily's broke." Stephen clearly did not expect such a reaction from his wife. so he immediately hurried to smooth out the resulting sharp corner and stop the scandal. But Emily was not going to stop. She accused her husband of indifference, which had already become commonplace in their family in recent years. And if earlier their relationship had been anything like normal, then with every year of their life together it was turning more and more into a neighborly one. "Stop it," the man exclaimed when he got tired of arguing with his wife. "By the way, I'm not sitting on my heel too and work, and I regularly spend time with your son, unlike his own father." Emily also realized that this was completely untrue. Ever since Christopher had disappeared from Emily's life and she had married Stephen, the boy spent most of his time with his grandmother. From time to time, Stephen would talk about his children, and Jenna would call her son to add fuel to the fire. "So you'll live under the same roof with a foundling," she used to say, when after many years of living together, Stephen still had no children, and Jenna had grandchildren. "Son, think about it. It's not too late to divorce and marry a normal woman. Why do you need this empty light?" Stephen, though he was quite insolent and narcissistic, in the depths of his feeble soul understood that normal women for such a groom as he, in line are not, and to find a new party and with an apartment work, and without children will be very problematic. Therefore, the man was in no hurry to change his watch for underpants. And unlike his mother, he was not too much interested in the problem of blood paternity. Although from time to time he made a pouty and dissatisfied look, reproaching his wife for the fact that she never gave him an heir. Stephen was afraid to cross his mother and never said anything directly to her. Only when the situation in the family came to a peak, the man told her what was happening and that she had been in hospitals for 6 months. Jenna asked, "What about work?" "So you're the only one working for the whole family, right, Mom?" "It turns out that way," sighed Stephen, who all the time that Emily was virtually bedridden because of weakness could hardly contain his inner anger not to snap. But no matter how hard the man tried to behave more or less decently, the day came when he couldn't stand it. It seemed as if at that moment he had no control at all. "Camille, what do you want from me?" "Resentful," he asked, when his mother-in-law suddenly started talking about how they were going to live their lives. "We did everything as you wanted. And in Moscow for counseling, went to Moscow, and even flew abroad. For which, by the way, took a huge loan, which must be repaid by someone. What else do you want me to do?" The woman had already mentally resigned herself to the fact that her daughter did not have long to live. All she wanted was for Stephen to get out of the apartment after she died, and she couldn't expect to find herself on the street in a completely stupid position. As soon as Emily was buried, Stephen wasn't himself. He drank uncontrollably, occasionally even tried to get his hands dirty. They lived like that for a month, and with each day Camille's hopes that after 40 days the man would pack his things and go to his mother melted. One day, when she came home and found the distinguished John, her patience came to an end. "What happened here?" shouted she, trying to get the truth from the sleeping Stephen. "Why is the child in tears?" "Baby, baby, baby," muttered Stephen, who wasn't even going to get out of bed for the sake of having a human conversation with his mother-in-law, and continued to lie there, slightly covered by the blanket. "It's not a child anymore. A child will know how to be rude to his father, or his mother will go to the other world. So you're here like a lunatic. What kind of person are you? Help the boy. And when Emily died, that bastard won't be any good to me at all. I haven't heard a word from his daddy in years. And I've raised him, brought him up, taught him about life. Only I didn't teach him how to be smart. But that's all right, we'll fix that." Only a few days later, John decided to tell his grandmother that his stepfather had beaten him severely. He was ashamed and would never have brought it up if Camille hadn't noticed the incoming bruises that would threaten after a beating, and they were very hard to hide. How did John not try to do that? "My goodness, my grandson," exclaimed the woman when, forgetting about the conspiracy, John went out in the morning into the kitchen, forgetting to put on a robe. "What a horror. How are you going to go to school with them?" At first she didn't realize the bruises weren't fresh. But after a few minutes the woman came to her senses after another sleepless night, and, realizing that John himself was a quiet, calm boy who was not affected even by adolescence, realized that except after a fight with Stephen, the bruises had nowhere to come from. "Come on, tell me quickly," she ordered. "I'm going to give this, you bastards, a sweet life." John looked down and told his grandmother what had happened. And at that moment, Camille was so angry that she was ready to throw her son-in-law out the door in his underwear, which she tried to do. As soon as her grandson left for school, "All right, you assholes of the human race, get up," Camille exclaimed as she entered the room. She could hardly understand her son-in-law, who was asleep on the bed and didn't understand what his mother-in-law wanted from him at such an early hour. "What are you doing? Have you completely lost your mind?" He swore, followed by a stream of eloquence that did not stop for half an hour. For the first time in a long time, Stephen allowed himself to tell his mother-in-law everything he thought about her. She, having listened silently to her son-in-law, tried to pull him off the bed and push him out of the door, but met with serious resistance. "You get the hell out of here," shouted Stephen, who by now was fully awakened and ready to fight for his territory with full force. "I have as much right to this apartment as you do, and I'm not giving up a meter to you." Gradually, the situation was heating up, and the scandal was gaining new momentum. Stephen did not control himself, and in a hearty slap or two grabbed her mother-in-law by the arm and dragged her to the door. Camille was outraged by this behavior of her son-in-law, and finding herself in the cold in one coat, which Stephen threw out on the stairs with her, seriously thought about calling the police. But after a while, when the woman calmed down, realized to stay in the same apartment, to which this crazy man really has a right, by law absurd and dangerous. Camille had nothing left but to call a good old friend, with whom they still to this day maintained a warm relationship, and ask to go to her at least for a few days. "Camille, what's wrong?" Evelyn, who was quite surprised by such an early call, and hearing Vanya's sobs in the receiver, got even more excited. "Don't get cold, or you'll get sick," she said after listening to Camille, who through her tears could hardly describe what had happened. "Come to me now. Do you have money for the road?" "Of course," the woman replied. "I have a pension card for transportation." "Thank you, Evelyn. I can't imagine myself what I'd do without you." The uncomprehending John, whom the woman had run to the school before the last class was over and was waiting for him in the hall, standing with a bewildered look in the check room and winding his scarf around himself, questioned his grandmother about what had happened. When he heard that Stephen had shooed her out of the apartment wearing only a coat, he was dumbfounded. "What does he think he's doing?" exclaimed the teenager. "He's a freak, but nothing will give him more horns, Pablo May." When Camille heard her grandson's words, she was shocked. John had never once in his life allowed himself to express himself like that. The woman was sure that he could not even know such words. But, as it turned out, she was wrong to try to calm him down. The woman herself became very nervous and, having hardly regained her composure, began to explain to the boy how they would live their lives in the future. "John, listen to me, please," Camille said. "Nobody needs horns. The media should remind you that he broke them off for you not so long ago. This man is inadequate, he's completely out of his mind, and it's dangerous for you and me to live there. We will live at my friend Evelyn's house until the inheritance comes in, and after 6 months we will take half of the apartment away from him and buy our own place." John resented the fact that some man would live in their apartment, while they themselves have to live with a friend of grandmother. He had never been able to love Stephen, even though the boy pretended to treat him well and even called him father sometimes. Still, he always felt some rottenness in him, so he did not trust the man, trying to communicate with him as little as possible, and doing it only for his mother, and in her presence, to demonstrate that he treated her husband as part of the family. The very next day after the incident, Camille went up to the house straight from the morning, and after freezing for several hours in the cold, she waited for Stephen to crawl out of the office, which he considered to be his. She knew that he could not abandon his work altogether. He had to live on something. And having studied her son-in-law's approximate schedule, she hoped that she would be able to get into the apartment to pick up her John's things. "My goodness," Evelyn exclaimed. "You're all icy." His hands sat up. "Why did you have to come up with such an elaborate scheme? Couldn't you just call him? You're so weird, Camille. You're afraid to go into your own apartment, even though you have as much right to it as he does." "If I had called him, he would have provoked me again," Camille answered. "Don't you understand? And you have to live to assert your legal rights, as you put it. And I'm not an old man anymore. And with a neighbor like my son-in-law, you might not live to see it." "Oh, and I always said that husbands were a problem," sighed Evelyn, who had separated from her only husband in her early teens and had never decided to go to the registry office. The woman had no children. She had lived with her mother all her life, and when she passed away, she occupied the two-room apartment she had inherited as her only daughter. "All right," she continued, "we're done talking. If we're not going to talk about sad things, let's go unpack." Evelyn had assigned one room to John, who was old enough to share with his grandmother. She and Camille had the second room. The women didn't complain about the cramped quarters, as they say, but no hard feelings. Against her friend's advice, Camille made an attempt to discuss the issue of Jenna's son's inheritance. The woman hoped to appeal at least to her conscience, but when she asked Jenna to persuade her son to give up the inheritance and take him to his own apartment, where he should live, since Emily had not invested a penny in the apartment. The mother-in-law took offense and told her mother-in-law everything she thought about both her and her late daughter. "How dare you call me and suggest such things?" Jenna was outraged. "And how did you even get my phone number?" "My son's marriage to your daughter was a charity event. Not only was she divorced at the time, but she had a trailer. What normal man wants a grandmother like that?" The key word is normal. And in response, Camille, who has been silent for so many years, but after such words could not contain her emotions. "What does normality have in common with your son, who has neither a stake nor a yard? He has never earned a normal income in his life, never provided for his family. A husband like that is a burden, not a support." Scuffle at minute 20. The women ended the conversation. Camille realized that it was useless to appeal to conscience and any norms of decency. She had nothing left but to accept the situation and wait for the moment of inheritance and the division of the apartment. The situation resolved itself in a most unexpected way, when 6 months later Camille tried to contact her son-in-law to discuss the sale and division of the apartment. Stephen's phone number was unavailable. The woman could not reach Jenna either. When she arrived at the apartment, to which she still had the keys, she found that no one had lived in it for a long time. "Wow," Evelyn exclaimed. "It's been unoccupied for at least 2 months. Look at all this dust." Running her finger over the real thing in the room, Camille found confirmation of her friend's words. But what to do, she didn't know. "Now what?" she asked, stopping in the middle of the room. "We can't just make the inheritance and dispose of the apartment as we see fit." "What if he shows up?" "Oh, I don't know. Evelyn answered with a sigh. "I think it would be better to discuss it with a lawyer." Camille had already repeatedly scolded and cursed herself for having registered the apartment with her daughter. If she had divided it up in shares when she bought it, there would have been no discussion. Stephen would have had no motivation to demand and wait for the inheritance, because after deducting her son's share, he would have been left with a meager amount, and he could have no share at all. What a fool I was. The woman complained about her own stupidity, but there was nothing she could do about the situation. "Listen, Camille, let's go to a notary I know. This Emily didn't leave a will, so there's no difference. And she, in turn, will not look for Stephen as the main heir by law. We don't have his phone number or address. How are we going to find him?" "We don't." Evelyn's offer was unexpected. Camille didn't want to share the apartment with Stephen. When it became obvious that Emily would pass away, the woman repeatedly asked her daughter to make a will, but she flatly refused to do so. Why would she do that? Even if she tried very hard, Camille could not understand her. In fact, Emily was afraid that after her death Stephen would be left without pants. No matter what she told him, no matter how he treated her, she still loved him. After her divorce from Christopher, Emily feared loneliness more than anything else. She was convinced that there was nothing worse than being alone. If in her youth she took it lightly and easily, so without remorse after 5 years of life together divorced her husband, then with age Emily began to perceive loneliness as a curse, and was truly grateful to Stephen for being by her side. She was afraid to share her feelings with her mother. Emily knew what reaction would follow if she dared to say what was on her mind. She knew from the beginning that after her death the apartment would be a bargaining chip. But she was sure that Stephen should be thanked for the years he had spent with her. After the execution of all the documents, Camille and her grandson returned to the apartment. Unlike her daughter, the woman immediately made a will, so that John did not find himself in the same stupid and ridiculous situation as herself. Life fell into a routine. John, who was in ninth grade at the time, was already making plans about where he would go to school. "I don't want to go to 10th grade, he told his grandmother, which disappointed her very much. "I want to go to college this year." Camille had always dreamed that her grandson would have a higher education. Emily was never able to learn any profession because at the age of 18, she got married and had a child without even a year of marriage. So after the divorce, she had to work like hell to somehow provide for her family, and most of the money she earned by hard work in the sewing workshop, where she was taken immediately after graduation, went to the maintenance of this spongers. Camille tried not to think about Stephen, as the thought of children only made her angry. "Gone from our lives and fine," she thought to herself, when very rarely the man reappeared in her thoughts. It seemed to the woman that the unexpected event in their lives with John ended, and after a few months she even accepted the reluctance of her grandson to finish the 11th grade and enter the institute. But a sudden ringing of the doorbell dashed the woman's hopes for a calm and measured life. When she saw her daughter's first husband, Christopher, on the doorstep, she could not believe her eyes and could hardly recognize him, as he had just found where we live. It flashed through her mind. Emily had not, however, given him the address of the new apartment. By then he'd disappeared from sight, and they hadn't been in touch. But Camille had no doubt it was him. The pale, depressed Christopher stared at her blankly. There was a silence between them that lasted for several minutes, until he was the first to speak. "May I pass?" asked Christopher, expecting no other answer than yes, of course. He knew that Camille, though a woman of temper, was kind and not vindictive. She made an inviting gesture in return, and, leaving his shoes in the hallway, the man washed his hands and made his way to the kitchen, where Camille had already put the kettle on. "Quite a surprise," she said meaningfully, breaking another silence between them. "How did you find us and why did you come?" Once again she thought to herself how simple things were for a man. This thought had been on her mind ever since her daughter's death. Camille realized for herself that she would never be able to leave her wife to her fate like that. In a difficult life situation, it is easy to leave a child and disappear in an unknown direction, and not think of her son for several years. That's easy. She tried her best to calm her anger to let him say something very important, but she managed to do it with great difficulty. "I'm dying," she heard after a few minutes of thought. "And I'd love to see my son, but that's not all I came for." The moment Christopher learned that Emily had a new life partner, he couldn't find his place. Jealousy, anger towards his ex-wife was eating him up from the inside out. When he realized that he couldn't cope living in the same city with her, he thought about moving, and his parents supported their son's decision. His biggest fear was running into them on the street. If he saw another man near her, he would immediately tear him to pieces. The idea that under the same roof with his son will live a stranger uncle who will bring him up, give him his view of the world, teach him life, was unbearable. Moving was the best way out of the situation. Parents had nothing to lose. They had long lived in a small town. For the sake of convenience and comfort, nothing kept them here, because all financial assets were concentrated in the capital. Christopher packed his things in a few days, and having rented the apartment bought after the divorce to the first couple, left the city with his father and mother. Over the years, he had risen quite nicely, but not just because he had a good parenting background behind him. Christopher worked like a horse. Only his work saved him from absurd and rash actions that he could have committed because of his intemperance and allowed him to distract himself from heavy thoughts. Divorce from Emily was not the only tragedy in his life. 5 years after the move, his parents were killed in a car accident. They were brought to the hospital still alive, and Christopher hoped to the last that the doctors would be able to pull them from the other side of the world. But they couldn't. Pain pierced him from the inside out. Christopher couldn't understand why he had to go through all this, why he had to go through such an ordeal. Why did he deserve it? Wondering questions to which he was unable to find answers, the man plunged back into work. After the death of his parents, he owed not only to himself, but to them as well. Christopher very much did not want to let the business they had created for years go to waste, and did everything in his power to prevent this from happening. And every year the business prospered. He could have found himself a worthy life partner, married and become a father. But he didn't want anything. There were always all sorts of women around him. Among them there were many worthy candidates, but there was no one like Emily. And although his mother and father were strongly opposed to marriage with a girl from a simple family and prophesied a quick divorce for his son, Christopher has never regretted that at one time linked his life with her. Let happiness was quickly ethical, but it was there. And unlike many people he knew, he did not marry for the sake of a check mark. But he considered divorce the biggest mistake of his life. Analyzing his past, he increasingly came to the conclusion that it could have been avoided, to find compromises, to agree. But then, being young, they were simply not capable of it. Thoughts about his son and shame in front of him for the fact that, giving in to the impulse of emotions, he disappeared from his life, did not give the man peace for many years. But he didn't dare to return so suddenly. And if it hadn't been for the fatal illness, which had come as a complete surprise, he would never have come. Christopher understood how it looked from the outside, and that it was not quite right to find out the address of his ex-wife and son through the acquaintances of the policeman and come down like snow on his head. But along with that, the man had also learned that Emily was dead, and after that he just couldn't help but visit. "John will be home from school soon," Camille said after listening to Christopher. "I think you two need to talk. You can't get the past back, and the future's pretty murky. And I don't just mean your life now, but his as well." Before John arrived, the woman had time to complain to Christopher that he did not want to get a higher education and refused to enroll in an institute. Christopher himself became a diploma holder at a rather conscious age. He studied by correspondence. When he was young, he also had absolutely no time for this. His parents did not insist. They realized that they were young, green. And even if the son never takes up the mind, standing on the porch with an outstretched hand will certainly not be. "How did you grow up, son?" exclaimed Christopher when John entered the apartment. At home, he recognized his own son, whom he had last seen many years ago when he was just a little boy. Upon seeing his father, the confused teenager could not utter a word. John was shocked by his sudden visit and had mixed and ambiguous feelings for his father. Camille correctly left them alone and, retiring to her room, said, "I think you two need to talk. There's a lot to talk about. After all these years." Christopher only nodded in response, and John remained standing in the hallway, confused. It was only a few minutes later that he was able to take off his shoes and walk with his father into the kitchen. At that point, he had not fully regained consciousness, so he just sat and listened to the man's story about his life. When the conversation came to the reason for Christopher's visit, John could hardly contain his emotions. "But why me?" he thought to himself as his father left. "Why did I have to go through so many trials? Why did I have to go through this?" John could not believe that his father, as well as his mother, would soon go to the other world. The teenager sincerely did not understand why fate was taking away all the people close to him. The next day he went to his grandmother and apologized in advance to his father, who thoughtfully left his phone number in case his son wanted to talk to him, and arranged a meeting with him. "Is there nothing that can be done?" "Depressed?" asked John. "You are not a poor man. You can afford any clinic and any specialists. Go abroad. Maybe they can help you there." Christopher was grateful to his son for such an interest in his fate. He himself repeatedly thought about his chances. The doctors in the capital gave ambiguous prognoses, and he had no time for long-term treatment abroad. To whom would he leave his business, and whom could he trust to manage it? During his absence, John was still too young and did not know anything about serious business. Christopher did not expect that if he passed away, he would leave everything to his son. John would be able to keep his business. Yes, he would be provided for the rest of his life, but it was not certain that he would be able to increase his capital. "In name, it's as simple as that," the man replied. "You're still young and you don't understand everything in this life. I can't just take off for the unknown. I have too many serious things to do." John refused to understand his father, but what business can there be when lives are at stake? Their conversation ended with Christopher starting to transfer his real estate holdings to his son, which he would take over as soon as he came of age. But the problems didn't end there. After the death of her daughter, Camille never pursued the issue of filing for custody of John. The woman was sure that after all this time she would not be disturbed, but she was wrong. New troubles came like a snowball and turned out to be completely unexpected for her and John. The clever and bright boy had told no one that his mother had died, neither his peers nor his school teachers. How they found out is unknown, but there was no time to think about it. When John was called in for a conversation by the social pedagogue, he was very surprised. "Did I do something wrong?" he asked fearfully. "I seem to behave normally. I attend all my lessons. I've never had any complaints." The class teacher ignored his questions and demanded that he go to Wendy's office. He had never liked her. When John saw the woman in the hallway, he never said hello to her and always tried to avoid her. There was something unpleasant about her. The boy could hardly sense that she wasn't a very nice person. And he was not mistaken. "Come in, sit down," the woman said. "I have a few questions for you." John felt uncomfortable the second he stepped into the office. But there was nowhere to go, and he understood that. No matter how much we wanted to, we had to listen to an unpleasant woman and answer her questions, which she asked for a reason. "We received information that you are living with your grandmother, which is not registered to you." "Custody is here," Wendy said. "Why didn't you inform your class teacher that your mother has been buried for 6 months? John, you're not a little kid. You should realize that. You can't do that." The teenager didn't want to go into details and tell Wendy about how he and his grandmother had been forced to wander around because of his stepfather's pranks after his mother's death. He didn't want to talk about the fact that his father had turned up and had been deprived of his parental rights by his mother, who had married another man who had turned out to be an immoral scoundrel. John and Camille did not understand why the social teacher and the class teacher were suddenly interested in their family. John had always done well in his studies, had never broken any school rules, behaved well, and had never been on the social teacher's radar. Something was wrong here. But what was it? "I'm going to the guardianship office tomorrow," Camille exclaimed, "and everything was documented. They can't deny me kinship care, especially since you're so old." "I'll call my father," John replied. "Will you go together?" "Why would you do that?" Camille was surprised. "I'll be fine on my own." She held no grudges against her former son-in-law, but she didn't want to interfere in family matters. What if he disappeared again? And then what? She didn't have much confidence in Christopher. But when John recounted her conversation with the social pedagogue, the woman realized that his presence was necessary. "That rat also said about the income, so Dad has to come with her, and he has to file for reinstatement of parental rights." "There's no way to do that. You don't work. I could be taken away from you." John was really worried about what had happened. He didn't want to end up in some orphanage. He was only 3 years away from adulthood. And the teenager thought it was silly what the class teacher and the social pedagogue were up to. And most importantly, why did they do it? Camille and John got the answer to this question a few weeks later, when Stephen appeared on the doorstep, who, like Christopher, fell on the woman and her grandson like a snowball. She was very much afraid that sooner or later he would show up. And so the day came. Forgetting her confusion, Camille concentrated and, gathering all her will in a fist, refused to open the man's door. "You can't keep me out." Stephen was indignant. Camille could hear his every word clearly from behind the door. The man shouted and shouted and shouted, proving his right to live in the apartment, but without getting the door opened, he left. Camille telephoned John at once and, informing him of Stephen's unexpected visit, urged him to be careful. "Of course it would be better if you stayed with your father temporarily," she told me. "It would be calmer that way." Christopher was not at all opposed to this. On the contrary, he was even glad when his son asked to stay with him. "It's your apartment," he exclaimed. "You can even live here and do not ask me, what is this nonsense? It's all yours." John continued to insist that Christopher take care of his health, and listening to his son, the man began negotiating with several foreign clinics. After he applied for reinstatement of his parental rights, it was as if he had grown wings. "I have a son again," he thought to himself. He had forgiven me. Christopher was sure that this was the best thing that had happened to him in his life. He really wanted to live and was willing to fight for it. Stephen, on the other hand, came back to town for the sole purpose of receiving his late wife's inheritance. He himself was terribly unhappy that he had to leave so suddenly. But he couldn't refuse his mother. "Mom, don't you understand? I could lose the apartment." He was indignant when Jenna informed her son that his grandmother had died and that they had to leave for another city right away. The woman had been waiting for this moment for a long time. With her own mother, she had little contact and little interest in how she lived. But for her money, which by the standards of Jenna's life was of great value, the woman claimed always. She had to attend her mother's funeral and immediately take care of the inheritance arrangements. The woman had not expected that she would not get a penny of her mother's fortune. "Nothing will happen to your apartment," Jenna replied to her son. "You are as much an heir as your mother-in-law is a son. You'll come back after you've settled everything and take your piece of the inheritance. Don't worry." Upon arrival, Emily went straight to her mother's friend from whom she had learned of her death. But the woman was none too happy about her visit. "I only called you because I couldn't do otherwise," Nancy said. "After all, Vanessa is your mother, and you have every right to say goodbye to her. But you have to realize that you've been out of her life for so many years." Jenna immediately realized that Nancy was gently hinting that it would be better if she got a hotel room and went back after the funeral. But the woman wasn't going to do that. After all, 3 apartments and a summer house were at stake. If all this is sold at her way of life, this money will be enough to the end of days. She wasn't going to give up just like that. After saying goodbye to Nancy, Jenna and Stephen went to her mother's apartment, where she lived permanently. But when they saw a young girl on the doorstep, they were surprised. "Who the hell are you? And what are you doing here?" indignantly exclaimed Jenna when she opened the door to her. The girl could not let the daughter of the deceased Vanessa into the apartment, but from such pressure and insolence at first she was confused. Molly had been caring for the woman for several years, ever since Vanessa began to feel unwell and had difficulty moving around her own apartment. Going to the store by herself was out of the question. When Vanessa realized she couldn't make it on her own, daughter she hadn't spoken to in years, there was no hope. She turned for help to the nurse who came to her house to give her shots. After gently asking the girl if she had a family and any other commitments besides work, Vanessa decided to offer her to move in with her, help with the household, clean the apartment, and become a full-time domestic helper. Molly declined. She was living on her own. Her parents were long gone. Her work as a modest nurse suited her, but it was too exhausting. To earn extra money, the girl gave injections at home. Vanessa was not only a grateful patient, but also a very nice person. So when Molly heard her offer, she willingly agreed to help the lonely woman. The salary was decent, but Molly took care of her not for the sake of it. At a certain point, the girl realized that they became close to each other. She not only read Vanessa books, which she loved to the point of madness, but also talked about her life. In turn, the woman also often reveled with the accident, told her about her daughter, who has a truly bad temper, because of which they do not communicate for many years. The great-grandson she'd last seen as a child? It was hard for Vanessa to imagine how he had grown up. She had never imagined that Stephen would be exactly like his mother. The same greedy, indifferent to other people's grief, interested only in money and permissiveness. They usually say they'd kill themselves for a penny. And that's exactly what Stephen was. Partly he inherited his character from his mother. But he himself never aspired to anything in life, except to jump on someone's neck. School was always hard for him. Jenna had high hopes for her son, which were not realized. But she couldn't stop supporting him. He was too precious to her. Therefore, the woman was ready to do anything just to relieve her favorite knee from the heavy, low-skilled work, which he devoted most of his life, and to provide him with at least some solid material support. And to do this was only possible at the expense of an inheritance. Jenna had never made much money. "Get out of here." Contemptuously looking at the girl, said Jenna. "We don't need any more servants." After that, the woman followed her into the apartment and sat down in the kitchen and waited for Veri to gather her things. After she left without complaint, putting the keys on the table for the new owners, Jenna said quite contentedly, "Yeah, I think as soon as we get the paperwork done, we'll give it up. Your grandmother was a very wealthy woman, so it's not the only thing we'll get from her. We'll rent it out for now, and then we'll sell it. Although it's not clear whether it's better to get a lot of money at once or to get a steady monthly income. Stephen, what do you think?" My son was thrilled with everything that was going on. He couldn't believe how lucky they were to finally have such a fortune. But he did not want to depend entirely on his mother to receive all of his grandmother's inheritance. He was still thinking that he should inherit Emily's part of the apartment. Otherwise, what was the point of all this? Jenna saw her son's anxiety, but she was not going to make concessions to him. "When everything is formalized, then you'll go." she said sternly. When Stephen once again reminded her that it was time for him to return to the city. "You're not going anywhere. If you want it so badly, call that old gimp and tell her not to go near the apartment." But Stephen didn't see any point in calling. When the date of the inheritance with his mother was approaching, he was in anticipation. And what was their disappointment when they found out that they would not get a meter, as she had willed. All this in passing. Jenna was indignant. How dare she? She has her daughter and grandson as her rightful heirs. Why on earth should we give our property to some leftist wench? The woman was angry. And Nancy, who for years had been her mother's faithful only friend, could not get through to her and explain to her, Jenna, that she had been absent from the deceased's life for so many years that anyone else in her place would have been ashamed to go after the inheritance. But Jenna was not going to stop. "I'm not going to leave it like that," she exclaimed. "I'm going to court. That little brat won't get a dime. This is my mother and Stephen's property. She has nothing to do with it." But expected for Nancy and totally unanticipated for Jenna and Stephen, the trial was lost. All the apartments Vanessa owned during her lifetime, the country house, became Molly's property, and there was nothing the desperate, aggressive woman could do about it. "I'll kill her," she exclaimed. "I'll send her to the next world, and all the good things will still go to her." It seemed to me that when Jenna lost the trial, she went mad with greed and anger. She had so hoped, so counted on the fact that she and Stephen would get this inheritance without any problems, that everything that was happening was a real blow to her. It was with difficulty that the son managed to persuade his mother to postpone temporarily the plan of revenge. Stephen once again reminded her that it was his turn to inherit. "All right, you've got it," unhappily muttered she. "Let's go to town. But as soon as you solve the question with the apartment, we'll come back here. And I'm not going to let it go." Not being a very smart man, Stephen decided to involve John. He also considered the possibility that Camille might have taken over the apartment during his absence. And that meant only one thing: she would not let him in, and he would have to go to the courts, which were not sure that they would take his side. That would be too much. Did the mother-in-law get custody of the boy? He's still a minor. Stephen could well become his guardian, and at the same time get the whole apartment. And once again, just like when Emily passed away, kick his mother-in-law out of the house. It was the thought that kept him going. The first thing he did after arriving in town was to call the school and, under the guise of a caring stepfather who had supposedly been so unfairly thrown out of John's life, start wailing about the guardianship, begging tearfully not to give him away. John Nevia Andreevna. Immediately after the signal was received, John's class teacher turned to the social pedagogue, and the latter, in turn, sent a request to the guardianship authorities and, having found out that the teenager in fact lives with his grandmother, without any legal grounds, called John for a conversation. "Why did you do it?" asked Jenna when she found out. "Are you a fool or what? Do you want an apartment or a burden?" "Mom, you don't understand anything," Stephen objected. "If I'd gone to court right away, I'd have gotten only part of the apartment, and that's not a fact. And this way I can get John's share. And if I can prove that the child lives in bad conditions, forgetting that Camille doesn't work and they live on her miserable pension, I can try to kick her out of the apartment and get the whole house. John will be 18 soon. What are the 3 years to wait? And he can be sent out by the neck, if his share is not allocated, but only to register. Learn your lessons, mother." Stephen's plans were not destined to come true when he learned that in the life of John and Camille again appeared Christopher, and takes a direct part in the life of his son. He realized that he would not be able to carry out his plans. But the apartment, where the former mother-in-law and stepson lived, again became a bargaining chip, as there was no will. Stephen still had the full right to claim the apartment and used it immediately. Camille John had no choice but to move into Christopher's apartment for the duration of the court proceedings. Only there could they feel completely safe. They were not going to live under the same roof as Stephen for a day. It was too risky. Meanwhile, Christopher was getting worse. The man needed urgent surgery, and he was forced to leave his son in such a difficult life situation. "Dad, why don't you take me to work?" the young man said before his father was about to fly abroad for some simple position. "I promise I'll be fine. You're crazy." Christopher, who could not allow his son to drop out of school, shouted back. You have only a little time to finish your studies, and then you will think about work, waiting for a trick and another meanness from Stephen. John decided to be on the safe side. He did not tell his grandmother or his father that the man caught up with him near the entrance and began to threaten him. So what, your grandmother? Riley asked. Stephen shouted, calmly walking home. John. They took my house away from me, and she's sitting there happy. I won't leave it like that. And you little ghoul? When your father throws you out, who are you going to live with? Your grandmother won't give you up. She's only got kinship guardianship now because your father's been reinstated. She's got no income, just a miserable pension. I'm a different story, especially since I'm your dead mother's legal husband. A widower raising a son. That's so touching. With no reaction to Stephen's words, John walked on by. But they were in his head, and when he got home, the first thing he did was to research how to become an adult before his time and not fall into a cable addiction to his miserable stepfather. John was even ready to get married. For a whole year now, he'd been dating his classmate Miranda, and even though marriage wasn't in the cards, the girl was supportive. I don't know how people will react, she said thoughtfully. They might resent it. But on the other hand, we were only going to get married later than 18 anyway. John realized that he needed a steady job to back him up. And even if his father refused to give him a job, he'd still find an alternative. Son, what are you up to? Asked the astute Christopher when he heard John's request to get him a job. Don't be silly. I know you've got a thought in your head so tightly that it's not going to get out. Share. John didn't want to make his father nervous. He prayed that the operation would be successful. And the man had more than one surgery, as he had been told in a foreign clinic after reviewing his medical records and medical history. But Christopher kept insisting, and the teenager had no choice but to reveal his plans to him. Having taken his father's word that he would not tell his grandmother anything, John told his father everything. What a bastard! Christopher exclaimed indignantly. What right has he to come near you? I'll give him a sweet life. Dad, calm down, replied John. You can't fix people like him. Stephen's a finished man. I'm sorry to have to say this, but if you're gone, I'm not likely to be given to my grandmother. She's old enough, and her pension is really small. How old are you now? The man was surprised. Can they really not let a child live a few years to adulthood where he wants and with whom he wants? It's not like you're a toddler anymore. But as much as Christopher resented the situation, he realized that child welfare workers are unpredictable people. And John, no matter how mature and conscientious he was still a minor. And until 18, he was not 2 or 3 days or a few months, but years. All right, Christopher agreed. I'll take you, but removed you will administer only on the condition that you will not abandon school and will devote no less time than usual to your studies. Grandma is already worried that you don't want to go to school, so at least you finished 9 grades normally. Take the exams, get your diploma. If you want to go to college, but you can't live without a diploma. After Christopher's departure, Camille and John began to prepare for the upcoming court hearing. The lawyer provided them with the same Christopher, and he tried his best to make sure that Stephen did not get a single meter. But despite all efforts, the man was awarded 1/3 of the apartment, justifying it by the absence of a will from the deceased Emily, to whom he was legally married. I actually have the right to half. He was indignant when he left the courtroom. Why only 1/3? This is outrageous. Jenna was also dissatisfied with the court's decision, but she saw no point in challenging it. From the point of view of the law, everything was absolutely correct and fair. Mother and son were the same heirs as the legal husband, who during the whole time of his wife's illness never once came to see her in the hospital, always finding various excuses. Now what am I to do with all this? He continued to resent it. If I sell this share, I'll get a penny. And what's the point of all this? Jenna did not care about her son's emotions. All she could think about was getting back to town and dealing with the matter. She hoped that she would be able to reach an amicable agreement with the girl, because the latter, in her opinion, supposedly had to have a conscience and cede to her legitimate daughter at least one of the 3 apartments and the country house. Stephen, however, decided to go the other way. As soon as he drew up the documents, immediately placed an advertisement for renting out one of the rooms. They wanted to do it legally, he thought angrily to himself. All right. According to the law, the tenants he selected specifically the most beaten, for which he put a paltry price for rent, wishing to rent a room in a decent house and not the worst neighborhood for a penny was a lot. But much to Stephen's dismay, they were all too decent to inhabit. Only one couple seemed promising to him. At the viewing, he noticed at once that the husband and wife were puffy, looked badly, and were obviously short of money. This is just the thing, Stephen thought to himself, about a couple who worked in a factory. And for several years they had to drive across town every morning. For several months after the trial, Camille and John did not visit their old apartment. They hoped that at least in the current situation, Stephen, dumb as a sober and adequate person, and in the future they would sell the apartment and divide the money. After the end of the court, Camille tried to talk to the former son-in-law and offer him to pay his share of the money. This was Christopher's initiative, but Stephen flatly refused. Yes, he seems to have one task and one principle. John grumbled unhappily. Just to fuck us up. What he himself got and how to dispose of it properly was not so important, but his thoughts were also preoccupied with his father and his state of health. Christopher called his son every day from abroad. After the operation, he felt unwell, but he was not discouraged. The doctors had given him hope, which he had already lost. It was not in vain that I listened to my son and turned to foreign specialists, he thought to himself, and for some reason he was sure that he would definitely recover and return to his former life. Grandma. I think we can already talk to Stephen about selling the apartment, reminded Camille John, who wanted the matter to be resolved as soon as possible. We're already dragging on for so long. My father will soon be back from abroad, and we haven't even consulted realtors yet. The woman realized that her grandson was right, but she was hurt to the core that she would have to part with the nest where her daughter lived, where her belongings and photos remained, and everything reminded her of her. When they entered the apartment and were shocked by what they saw there, the kitchen was impossible to enter, for there was a tart, repulsive odor of rotten food. The stench from the bathtub was no better. The two closed rooms appeared to be ignored. Though it was a little smaller, it was a mess than the one Stephen had rented out. Still, it was more than obvious to both Camille and John that they were welcome guests and regularly arranged their own affairs there. To what do I owe my former mother-in-law? He asked wryly. I came to our, unfortunately, shared apartment, she exclaimed. What are you doing here? What is this horror? Stephen laughed out loud in response and, after a few minutes, said, So what did you want? I have the right to rent out my room. The court awarded me a third of the apartment, which is one room, a third of the kitchen, bathroom, hallway, and corridor. You wanted it to be legal, didn't you? Well, it's all legal. It's not according to the law, it's against any law. You had to ask my permission, and I would never in my life have allowed you to let such natives into the apartment, Camille replied. I'm calling the police. She hung up the phone, and Stephen realized that this was not a white matter. Serious problems were in store for him. Half an hour later, Stephen rushed to the apartment, but by then the police were already there. I've gotten married on my own head, Stephen exclaimed. No use, only loss. After the police left, the man realized that he had no other choice but to evict the tenants. Shocked by this suddenness, they found themselves on the street later that day. The previously so polite, correct Camille did not become ceremonious and did not agree to any compromise. After you and your assholes here, a whole brigade should be called to give up the apartment, the woman resented. Stephen was furious. Not only was he deprived of any rental income, even if it was pennies, but he also had to pay a fine. It was a small sum, but for him, a man who lay on the couch more often than he went to work, even these expenses hurt his pocketbook. The man's troubles did not end there. A few weeks later, when he was already in full swing together with Camille, traveled to the apartment showings because he saw no other way to resolve the situation. Except to sell the common living space with his stepson's mother-in-law, he received a phone call from his mother. What's wrong with your voice? Stephen asked excitedly, hearing Jenna sobbing into the receiver. Something's wrong. Since she'd gone to town to deal with her grandmother's inheritance, she hadn't been in touch. Stephen, completely caught up in his problems and the hustle and bustle of business, didn't even notice it. Once in 3 days he remembered that he should call his mother, but also safely forgot about it because of severe stress and fatigue. Son, I'm in jail, mumbled Jenna. She fulfilled her promise, and when she talked about how she wouldn't leave it like that, she wasn't kidding. Having arrived in the city, the woman immediately visited the apartment, where by that time had already dominated, speaking word for word. And Jenna decided to pretend that she wanted to reconcile with the girl. She apologized for the scandal that she made when she came for the first time, remembered her deceased mother with tears in her eyes, and pretended to regret that she had not communicated with her in recent years. Unbeknownst to Varia, she had slipped a poison into her tea, which was supposed to take effect a few hours later. The woman had the foresight to wipe off all her fingerprints. Before leaving, she checked the floors, wearing booties and leaving the door open. And since she didn't have keys to the apartment, where Molly kept them, she didn't know, walked away. The girl fell asleep almost immediately after drinking the poisoned tea, but she still had a few hours to live. She was saved by a lucky coincidence. That day Nancy could not reach her by phone and, frightened that something had happened, went straight to Molly's house. She had maintained a relationship with her friend's faithful, devoted assistant, and after her death they often called each other and from time to time even visited each other for tea. Seeing the open door to the apartment, the woman immediately suspected something wrong. And when she found Molly slumped on the floor, she immediately called an ambulance. "Half an hour more, and we wouldn't have saved her," the doctor said. "Some kind of specific poisoning, like food poisoning, but that's not it." The poison was very rare indeed. Jenna had once bought it from a gypsy woman to discreetly poison her mother, but had never gotten around to it. When Jenna was leaving the apartment, she made one oversight. The woman accidentally left a salt shaker with microscopic remnants of poison on the nightstand in the hallway, where she put it when she mopped the floor. But that wasn't her only mistake. Unbeknownst to herself, Jenna had dropped her glove. She only discovered it when she tried to burn it in the neighboring woodshed. "Oh shit," she thought to herself. "What a fool I am. I should have gotten regular rubber ones. Why didn't I do that?" It was a rhetorical question. Nancy, who immediately guessed who had tried to poison Molly, went to the police. Sweat, grease traces inside the gloves, fingerprints at the solyanka, which the woman did look at, and a few prints in the apartment itself, which she had inadvertently left, were sufficient evidence to arrest and charge her. How could it be, Mommy? Stephen thought to himself. How could you settle accounts like that? But thoughts of his mother soon dissolved into a blur. Stephen did not grieve long after she was imprisoned. On the contrary, after a few weeks he found a lot of advantages in the situation. Now he could live alone in the apartment, and no one would be bothering him for several more years. How was that a bad thing? For Stephen, it was simply wonderful. From time to time, out of politeness, he even went to see his mother and sent her messages. But more and more often he found himself thinking that he did not miss her at all and was not looking forward to her return. After the sale of the apartment, the man received his share and completely stopped working. He was happy that the proceeds of the money will be able to rest on their laurels for some time, and then it would be later, and life itself would somehow turn everything around. He was sure of it. When his mother came back from prison, he was forced to go to work. Jenna was not taken anywhere because of his criminal record. Money was running out, and they needed something to live on. Every day they argued and nagged each other until they finally decided to trade their magnifying glass for 2 dorm rooms and move out. By that time, Jenna managed to get a job as a janitor, and Stephen continued to earn money the same way as before, periodically driving passengers on his old summer. Unlike his former son-in-law, who was only looking for a profit in life, but as a result never found anything. The marriage of John, Camille, and Christopher turned out well. Foreign doctors were able to put the man on his feet, and after several operations and rehabilitation, he returned to a full life. John decided to leave with his father to the capital and take his grandmother with him, without whom he could not live a day. Miranda, who by then had already become his official fiancée, went with them. As he had planned, John left school after 9th grade and, moving to the capital, enrolled in college programming. He was so much interested in the work he was doing while Christopher was away that he forgot all his old dreams and completely immersed himself in computer technology. Miranda also went to college. She decided to become a journalist. The girl decided that since fate had arranged it in such a way that she found herself in the capital, it would be foolish not to take advantage of this opportunity and not to realize herself in a profession in which it is quite problematic to be in a small town. From time to time, they came to town to check on the condition of Camille and Christopher's rented apartments and to visit Emily's grave in the cemetery. After the sale, the woman immediately bought another apartment, leaving herself a small amount of money to live on. Still, her pension was small, and she did not want to sit entirely on the neck of her son-in-law and grandson. Together, they always remembered Emily, who was John's favorite mother, for Christopher, the woman who gave birth to his son, and to Camille, the only beloved daughter. Warmly remembered and very sorry that Emily was not with them, but hoped that she was watching them from above and rejoicing at the family reunion.